Thanks for joining. I'm Lane Mosier. I'm the Education Program Specialist here at the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. We're doing this in person at our Forestry Center Library for an audience. So just trying not to get seasick looking at the camera.
Sorry, everybody.
Today we have Dr. Andrew David, our very own from the Forestry Center and University of Minnesota, who will be talking about selecting your next seedling. There will be some time for questions at the end. Feel free to use the chat. And also there in the chat, you can see our 2023 webinar series out through June. We will have the July through December, the other half coming up here in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that. And I'll just throw to Andy.
Yeah, thank you, Lane. Folks, I just want to reiterate something Lane said earlier, and that is, if you have a question, we have a couple of capable people just monitoring the chat box. So just go ahead and ask it. Don't wait till the end because there's probably someone else thinking the same thing. And then Eli or Lane can field that question and then kind of send it over to me. So selecting your next seedling, where should it come from? You might be a little disappointed to know I'm not going to tell you exactly where and when to buy it, but hopefully we'll give you enough tools that you can begin thinking about how to approach this problem, and then go ahead and that makes your life a little easier when you're doing reforestation work in the future. So in case you were wondering if this doesn't look familiar, that's Eastern hemlock. Kind of grew it in my backyard, so it's not, it's still young. Anyway, where are we here? Will it move it? No, it doesn't want to see it.
Maybe just move your mouse, Andy, to the slide. I wonder if it's in Zoom instead of.
Let's try this. Okay, so this is me, and this year, for the first time, admin asked us in admin CFANs asked us all to create a one kind of like slide of who we are and our research interests. And one of the things, this seemed really annoying, but actually it's kind of turned out pretty well because it gives folks at a glance kind of a snapshot of the things that I do. And so, you know.
Sorry, Andy, 1 sec. We're sharing the opposite window here.
Oh, that's not good.
No.
Yeah.
All good.
Perfect.
Thanks
now
for your patience.
What we want to see.
Yep. So let me think back here.
Okay. So, you know, really at the top, applied forest genetics, gene conservation, restoration work. If you know me from a while ago, I did a lot with hybrids, hybrid aspen, hybrid large, etc. Seed production, collection, storage. Anyway, this kind of gives you a sense of the research that I do and the things I've been involved in over time. So today, what I really want to do is break this down into 4 different topics, really. Kind of a little bit on history of climate-based seed zones, seed transfer guidelines, you know, where we think we should be collecting seed, time of transition, what's coming, and then a couple slides on ideas to think about when faced with regeneration tasks. All right. So I think we can all agree that we've got a couple overarching goals, really, and that is quite simply, at a minimum, we want seedling survival and growth to be equal to average for the species in the area. And bonus points, if we can get seedlings, you know, that have survival and growth rates that are higher than average for species in the area. When you think about it, this is a lot like, you know, a medical doctor's practice. And the first comment, first do no harm. All right. And then everything beyond that you can do to help the patient, everything beyond that you can do to improve the situation is a bonus point. So how do we get at least to here? And in reality, getting to that minimum, getting survival and growth to at least the average for the species in the area That's really a function of having enough collections to make sure that you are adequately representing that genetic variability. And so what I tell people is, magic number is right around 25, 30. You collect from 25 to 30 non-related trees in a given area, and you basically captured that average. Right? If you're going to go out and you're just going to collect from one or two trees that are sitting in a cemetery someplace, you're taking a risk. All right, you're basically taking a risk. You don't know if those trees are above average, average, or below average, and you don't have enough of a sample size to kind of mitigate that risk. So, bonus points, seedling survival and/or growth. Really, a lot of this has to do with knowing the performance of your trees. That's kind of where the Minnesota Tree Improvement Cooperative comes in, or a breeding program and a selection program, and having that information allowing you to go ahead and make certain selections, getting 20, 30, 40 individuals that have that genetic variability, but also have higher survival, higher growth. All right. If we go back to the mid 50s, early 50s, we see that's really kind of the beginning of a number of things. One, it's the realization that we can't, if we want to plant jack pine, we just can't get jack pine from anywhere and plant it because it's not well adapted. It's also kind of the beginning of forest genetics in the United States as more of a practice discipline using scientific principles. And in the Lake States, Rudolf, who was a Forest Service researcher, said, I'm going to try to create some climate zones. And those might inform us about how to practice seed transfer. And so Rudolf created in the Lake States this climate model, if you will. Climate model is not the right word, but really kind of created seed zones for the Lake States. He based this on average January temperature and then degree days above 50 for the season. He just larger zones and then subdivided some of those zones. This is really messy. All right. Most of us look at this and go, I couldn't practice forestry, seed source control, and seed transfer guidelines with all of this information. But this is what the numbers tell us. And we see some broad generalities, okay? Interior Minnesota, typically relatively cold and a little moist. Over here, cold and dry. Down here, certainly warmer, one. There's the Pelston Plain that shows up. You get that Hancock, Houghton, snow load up on the Keweenaw Peninsula. We see that we've got a transition here. It's also cold throughout northern Wisconsin. But in general, this is a little messy. If we take a look at Minnesota DNR years ago, they kind of simplified this and they came up with their seed zones for the state, 6 different seed zones. And if you look, it's roughly based on Rudolph's climate zones for Minnesota. And I'm not going to say that they borrowed directly, but I think what they did was they used this plus additional information to come up with something that works for them. All right. And really that's worked for the entire state for a number of decades. 6 seed zones, you collect seed, you buy seed, you transfer seed to either Bedora or Willow River at the time. Then you went ahead and stored it by seed zone. You planted it out by seed zone into beds. They were tracked in as per seed zone. When they were lifted and stored again and then shipped out, they all were tracked by seed zone. So this is really great because you can say we have planting in the southern zone, and this is 10. I got to look closely. It looks like 106. If we're going to do any work in 106, we're going to plant 106 in 106. Seed from 106 gets planted in 106. If we go ahead and we see that, 105 Centrals wants to plant some, but they've run out of stock or they don't have any. We allow transfer between adjacent zones. That works really well. All right. And it means that what we're doing is we've got a large enough sample. We're planting across the state with known seed transfer guidelines. We're capturing that mean. We're getting that survival. We're getting that growth. That's at least as good as the wild population because we're collecting from the wild population. What doesn't it do? You put something up like this on a map, it's completely isolated. We saw Rudolph's and we know that Wisconsin exists here, so although sometimes we really don't want to admit it. And then there's Michigan way over here. And this is problematic because some people will say, look, thou shalt not collect beyond those borders. All right. In reality, we know that's a little different. We should be able to do additional work. And so, like I said, 6 seed zones, we transfer between adjacent seed zones, seed track from collection to deployment. One other thing I want to add here is that if you go through the really old forest genetics literature, what you will find is that we know you can transfer seedlings or seed roughly about 200 miles north-south without impact. All right, so that's kind of keep that little nugget tucked in your head. Away from large bodies of water, mind you, away from anything that's really going to disrupt, and I'll say large bodies of water here. We're not talking Mille Lacs, we're not talking Leech Lake, but something like large Lake Superior. And in the absence of elevation, and in Minnesota, we don't have enough elevation to make it worthwhile talking about. Out west, they do. 200 miles north-south, all right? Without loss of survival, without loss of growth. Beyond that, you're taking a risk. Historically, that's what the literature tells us. All right. We also go, and this is Wisconsin DNR. This is their, we put this out more than a few years ago now. This is for jack pine. And they looked at it, and if you know Wisconsin, they have this transition zone, all right? Central hardwoods, northern hardwoods, if you will. But they pay a lot of attention to this transition zone, and it makes sense for them. All right, there's a mixture of the 2 zones here, above and below, southern and northern. And they say, if we want to plant jack pine, we can, and we want to plant in the south of the transition zone, we can take anything from this red area and plant it in here. That's adequate for us. All right. Likewise, north of the transition zone, we can take jack pine from anywhere in here. They also recognize this is off limits to us. That's completely different climate. It's not appropriate. And so this is really just kind of, if we were to go back to Rudolph's, we'd see that this is exactly very similar to it. Not although in the broader 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, and not the subcategories. All right, so recognize people have been working on this issue for a while. We've got seed zones set up. We have seed transfer guidelines set up. Some of them can appear to be very narrow. Some of them can be broader in scope. So this is something, and I'm just going to put this website up here, easternseedzones.com. If you remember Carrie Pite, some of you probably do, when she left MTIC, she went to work for the Forest Service. One of the first things that she worked on was creating seed zones and seed transfer guidelines for the Eastern US. All right, and that's kind of what this website will take you to. This is really in recognition that we need to be looking much broader than a single state, and potentially much broader than a region, the Lake States region. But what I want to draw your attention to is the way this is set up. It's the Eastern US, it's based on ecoregions, minimum winter temperatures, and then she did a really, really smart thing. She came back to each state and the foresters in that state and said, does this make sense to you? Okay, I'm trying to set up these seed zones, but you know, and you practice forestry. Does this make sense to you? And if you were a forester in the last 5 years and you didn't get that question, I'm sorry, but probably someone up here got asked it in your stead. So if you notice, there's a lot here. Now 9 seed zones in Minnesota instead of 6, but they're still very, very similar. This would be 106. It just happens to be split east and west because of that precipitation gradient. All right, and we see a lot of that. 7 gets a little larger. This is all tacked to county level. All right. When she came to us, we said, you cannot make this all one color. St. Louis County is just way too big. She's like, oh, we can't break it up. We can't. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And she did. And I think we actually went back to the DNR seed zone map and said, look, they do it. You can do it too. We fought for this. It's not much. It's a tiny little sliver, but it's right along the lake shore and a bit inland, because we know that trees that grow there are not well adapted to the interior. That lake really impacts the genetics and the adaptability of those seedlings.
Andy, just a clarification, because it's barely visible on the screen, but you're pointing out that there's a super narrow seed zone right along the shore, correct?
Absolutely, 19.
Yeah.
That's a super narrow, it's really the shore and then up. I won't say the cliff, but up to the plateau, and then it goes inland about maybe 3-5 miles. But that area is really special. Okay, and I mean, it's special for a number of reasons, but genetically, for example, we know that white spruce collected along here and planted inland in Grand Rapids, roughly the same latitude. You're just moving them maybe 100 miles. They grow poorly here. They're just not well adapted. And this is okay because we don't plant a lot in that area. And if you've ever been up there and spent time up there, it's a lot of natural regen and a lot of fenced areas. There's a lot of private land, there's some public land, but the state parks typically don't have huge planting programs. And they usually want to work with things that are local. And that makes sense, especially along that area. All right, what else is interesting on this map? So we've talked about this division. We've got a few more seed zones. Oh, here, this is typical. Grand Rapids, I used to do work around Rhinelander. And it was amazing how similar the winter was, and how similar weather was, and how similar spring was. And we see that this actually does make its way into this cold area, makes its way into with northern Wisconsin. Flanked on either side by a slightly warmer area. Western half of the UP slightly warmer. Again, you see the Keweenaw show up. But the idea is here, we've done a little bit more fine mapping for seed zones. The other part of that is we're still allowing transfer between adjacent seed zones. That's the recommendation. So if you're planting in 22 and you're interested in northern red oak or white oak, you can pull that from 50 or you can pull that from 23. And that 23 is all the way down into Iowa, parts of Illinois, and then up into Wisconsin, almost up to Green Bay. So there's all of a sudden, we're recognizing that there's a whole host of areas we can collect from. The other part of this is, I was part of the panel that looked at DNR seed zones and seed transfer zones, seed transfer guidelines. And one of the things we really wanted to impress upon that group was that you need to be able to go across state borders, because we knew this was coming out. And we wanted to have the flexibility to go down and pick up something from a warmer seed zone if we could. By if we could, I mean, if you can actually get seed from here. We'll talk about that in a moment. But so you've now seen this iteration with Rudolph's, really good work, but a little too busy to work with. The DNR's original 6 seed zones, And then the idea that, we really should be thinking and working across a much broader area. All right. Are there any questions showing up in the chat?
Yeah, one just showed up.
So this is if I paid them.
Yeah. Doesn't always make more sense to transfer seed from an adjacent seed zone to the south, given climate change. I wonder if that person wants to elaborate a little, or Andy, if you have anything there.
I think what they're asking is, and they can correct me through you on chat if I'm wrong. Doesn't it make sense if climate change is here, doesn't it make sense to just always go and get seed from the south? Well, and we know that 200-mile limit, if we think about Grand Rapids, which is, roughly here. I teach on main campus. And I'll be walking around in the fall, and Elaine probably remembers this. There'll be acorns on the ground. I'm stuffing my pockets. I bring them home and I'll grow them up and I'll plant them out here. They're doing fine. I mean, I've got trees on my property from the cities, and if I fence them, I don't see much of an issue with survival at all. So that's kind of within that 200-mile distance. If you think technically, you would think we could go from 7 to 8, but we couldn't do 22. So how do you handle that? I mean, you may be constrained at your organization by what you can do, or if you're not at an organization that has constraints about seed zones and seed transfer guidelines, you could go ahead and say, okay, we could pick from the, if we know it's from north zone, 22, that probably work within that 200-mile radius. But if we're going down all the way into Iowa, you may be at a risk. And so part of this is how comfortable are you with risk? But with the person on the chat line, I agree. If you're in 6, you could conceivably always pick from 7 and plant in 6. If you're in 21, you've got a lot of options. You could do, 50. You could do 22, but that's a huge distance. That's much farther than 200 miles. At that point, I start to worry. But there are ways to mediate that risk, and we'll kind of get to them.
Question about when did this new Eastern Seed Zone map come out?
I think in the last 2-3 years. So it's relatively new.
Great. Yeah. And that's all we've got right now.
Okay. So I'm going to move on here. You probably remember this slide. So here are our overarching goals, right? At a minimum, we want to have the average. Bonus points if we can exceed the average. And just as the chat commenter was saying, this really gets complicated with climate change. All right, Minnesota geography and species ranges. We got a little bit about that Minnesota geography when we took a look at number 19. And species ranges, climate change. Let's take a look at that and see what we can do. So really, when we think about climate change, this is exactly what we're facing. This is what people fear. And I've shown this slide is now getting pretty dated, as I am as well. But it really captures very well what we fear with climate change. All right, so let's take a look at number 1. And then the fear really is that conditions are changing faster than populations can adapt. There's your take-home message. At least that's the fear. Stable climate. We have a warm area in a species range and a cool area. You can say north, south, however you want to do it. Actual genotype, best genotype. And when these match, best genotype in the warm area is E, and the actual genotype is E. All right, perfect. Everyone's happy. We get pollen and seed dispersal, connecting different populations throughout the range. You can kind of ignore mean phenotype, fitness optimum, just recognize actual and best. In a changing climate, all right, things are starting to warm up. We shift this. So this down here is actually telling us what the weather is like. And for the populations, they're not moving, but the weather is moving. And so we shift. And now E, which is the warmest, is now set over here in a population that isn't really set up for the warmest genotype or for the warmest climate. What happens out here? That edge, that population at the extreme south is becoming extinct. It's extirpating. Doesn't happen overnight. It'll happen over decades. But the fear is that this population disappears. Those at the southern edge of the range have the most climate stress. In a rapidly changing climate, we're severely mismatched. All right, we may be mismatched by 2 population levels. What happens here? We don't see optimal growth. We don't see optimal regeneration. We don't see optimal survival. And so what we see are declining species throughout the range because they're not matched up with the climate that currently exists. All right, so there's a lot on here. Hopefully that helps demystify it. But in reality, this is the way geneticists and population geneticists think about climate change and adaptation. So if you go online, and this is not as recent as the Eastern Seed Zones, this is the Forest Service Seedlot selection tool. And it can be fun to go play with this. And if you're not careful, you can get lost in it, going down individual rabbit holes, but also there's so many options. So let me say, one of the things you can do is define a geographic area and say, where should I get my seed from? The other thing you can do is if you're sitting on a bunch of seed, you can say, I have this seed from this timeline, whether it be this year or 10 years or 20 years ago. Where is this seed best adapted now? So I chose the former because I don't have a bunch of seed at home sitting in a cooler, although Fedora might. And what I said was, all right, I live about here. This is the zone that they've created when I click here. And right now, if I check any species, not just, you can choose an individual, but I said all species. And really what they're saying is for 2011 to 2040 time period, if I want to plant in this zone, I should be collecting in this area of red or yellow. And notice there's a lot of yellow, and it even kind of goes over here. I don't know what the heck is in South Dakota or what's going on over here, but apparently you could collect there as well. So this is great. Oh, look, we could be collecting within this zone for this zone. It makes sense. That's kind of what our seed zones tell us. Seed transfer guidelines tell us. And you look at that, oh, that's for 2011 to 2040. So we're already a decade into this. Well, what happens if we do 2040 to say 2070? Oh, 2041 to 2070. If we want to select seed that's adapted to this region for this period, 2041 to 2070, we should be collecting over here, more central Minnesota. All right, perhaps South Dakota over here. There's also some points in the UP. That's kind of interesting. It's a little darker red. But wait a minute. What's actually over here? And this is where this tool falls down a bit for Minnesota, because if you think about it, here's this area it's defining, and it's a little blurry. I'm sorry, but I had to make it larger and then go ahead and line it up with our Minnesota here. This is red pine. All right. If you want to plant red pine around Grand Rapids and you want it to be adapted to 2041 to 2070, you should be collecting over here. There is no red pine over there. There just isn't. You know, this seed selection tool works really well out west, or if you're in the middle of a broad species range. And I'm not trying to knock this. It's just a function of Minnesota geography and the fact that a number of our commercial species right now, things we think about like red pine, jack pine, white spruce, black spruce, what do they have in common? They kind of reach the southern edge of their range in many cases in central to northern Minnesota. I mean, you know, there's white spruce, this is tough. I know people at Landon have been looking at this map for a long time. You know, there's black spruce. And don't forget, it's those populations at the southern edge of the range that suffer the most from climate change. And so finding seed in those populations can be particularly difficult. But if you want to save them, if you want to have value, perhaps we should be working in them now to go ahead and create seed orchards or create some way of perpetuating those genotypes so that we can have access to them in the next, 5-10 years or so. So recognize that Minnesota's geography creates an issue for us because we can't just go farther south to collect the seed from the species that we're used to working with, or that our economy in northern Minnesota is kind of built on. That's a tough ask, especially if it doesn't exist. So what's coming? And I'm sure, I could have asked you all this at the beginning of this, and you would have said, oh yeah, well, we know we're going to see more central hardwoods. That means we're going to see more oaks and hickories. Yes, we're going to see more oaks and hickories. Depending on where you are in the state, if you're in the southern part of the state, you might see, we might see more tulip poplar. We might see, bottomland hardwoods are gonna change. You're gonna see more black cherry. That's not a bottomland hardwood. That really kind of belongs up here. But you'll see more sycamore. You'll see more eastern cottonwood. You'll see more silver maple, etc. The other thing I want to point out. We're seeing more central hardwoods, oaks, hickories, those are the big ones. We see more bottomland hardwoods. There is this one. We already know eastern white pine. It's already here. I just want to point out to you that if you look at the range map for eastern white pine, it's pretty extensive. And it'll go all the way down to northern Georgia. All right, there's eastern white pine and there's adaptation to warmer conditions throughout here. And actually, if you think about the way this works and you remember that transition zone, and in essence, that guideline for jack pine seed transfer from Wisconsin DNR, you could probably follow that pretty closely for eastern white pine as well. That means this upper portion, you'd have to look elsewhere for it. And maybe the seed selection tool could help with that. But eastern white pine is poised to have a much larger influence than it does now. More so than jack pine, more so than red pine. I included this. This is some, hopefully they can they see me if I stand here?
I think so. Yeah. Yep.
Maybe I'll just use the pointer.
Well, I've reminded folks, you can, if you click view in the upper right, you can change your screen layout. Sometimes Andy's pointing to the screen. You can enlarge his video panel or however you want to do that. But yeah, you're good. We're seeing you, Andy.
So Margaret Davis, who did work at the University of Minnesota, did some really neat work using pollen out of bogs. And then she went ahead across the eastern US, and then she went ahead and reconstructed post-glacial recolonization routes for various species. And one of them is eastern white pine. And you can really just kind of see how this traveled over time. And my point here is, if you're ever curious about where you should potentially go to select for a given location, say in Minnesota, and you want something that is relatively recent in terms of ancestry, you can use these maps to realize, these are 6,000 years ago, 8,000, 10, 12. Our most recent individuals are from literally UP of Michigan and parts of northern Canada. And we could be collecting there if you wanted to target, eastern white pine in northern Minnesota.
Andy, we got a comment from the Zoom audience. Better when you point than to use the pointer because they can't see the pointer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. So these lines, they look like isobars. They're really thousands of years ago. And so they just kind of follow those lines to understand the movement of this species as the glaciers receded. But if you're interested in finding, sources for Minnesota that are ancestrally relatively close, you can use a map like this to help you understand what that post-glaciation route looked like. All right. Questions and suggestions. These are things that I get or have gotten in the past when I talk to people about seed source control, seed transfer guidelines, and just kind of regeneration in general. And one of the first ones I get is, artificial versus natural regen. Should I really be doing natural regeneration? I mean, if I'm looking at a timeline of 70 years or 80 years to harvest, should I just plant and get things from, the seed zone south of me or what? So I'm gonna say this is gonna depend on your level of risk. Natural regeneration is always your cheapest option, unless of course you have to do it over and over and over again because it doesn't take. But the quickest way to a fully stocked stand is always artificial regen. All right, that typically works best. It works relatively cleanly. We've got good seedlings, or where to get good seedlings from, and it gives you a lot of advantages and options when it comes to planting. Natural regen, what's going to help is if you're using, a seed tree or shelter wood or something along those lines, and so I'm not talking about aspen here, that's completely different. Those genotypes regenerate. But what you're doing is you're allowing a recombination of all those genes. And then you're allowing weather and climate to select better genotypes. So in that respect, you're going to probably be and have a slightly better adapted climate if you're doing natural regen than the seedlings. Then if you were to just compare those to the trees and the genotypes that are on site already. So yes, this gives you way more options, as it always has, as long as you know where they're coming from. Where should I source my seedlings? We kind of alluded to that earlier chat. Nothing wrong with going to the seed zone to the south. One seed zone south, that's pretty safe. You want to go farther than that, you're going to start accumulating some risk. How comfortable are you with that risk? For some people, if they're really organized and this is something they want to try, you could say, set up a seed orchard, set up a shelter wood or set up a seed tree method, do some natural regen, get artificial seedlings from one zone south and two zones south and intermix them. Then you've got a lot going on, and that can be a lot to handle. But in reality, what it does is you're trying to cover all your options. You may see higher levels of mortality, and you may have put natural regen and the cost of artificial regen in the same site. But if you have a way of doing that, you're really covering a number of different scenarios and possibilities. I kind of think of that as a portfolio, a mixed portfolio, if you will, for retirement. Are you in stocks only? Are you aggressive stocks? Are you aggressively in aggressive stocks? Or are you, more balanced with some money markets as well? Okay, index funds. However, that I can throw those words out. You know what I'm talking about. So what species should I plant? Well, we know what's coming, right? And there may be difficulty in getting swamp white oak. Everybody wants swamp white oak. If you take a look at the range of swamp white oak and where we could potentially collect it from, that's pretty small. And yet there seems to be no shortage of swamp white oak in the marketplace. It's almost like magic. They're making it appear. And that leads me to another point. If you are getting seeds and you're buying them or you're ordering, you're in charge of reforesting an area, you have the right, I would say the responsibility, to ask where that seed is coming from. You should know where it's coming from. And if they can't tell you, question the source. Simple as that. You're making a decision that is going to impact that site for the next 50 to 100 years. You need that information. And as the caretaker for that land, you should have access to that. Be comfortable with what you're putting out. And I'm not saying you have to be comfortable with going 2 zones south. I'm just saying you need to be comfortable and you need to be able to defend the decisions you're making. Hopefully, there's enough information in places like this and online that you can make those decisions and know why you're doing it. All right, how comfortable with risk are you? And that's really kind of the last one. And that goes to that whole portfolio. It goes to, you know, artificial versus natural regen. It also goes to how far south you want to get your seedlings from, but also question that seed provider, that seedling provider. All right, I think summary. We talked a little bit about historical climate-based seed zones, Rudolph's DNR 6-zone map, eastern seed zones, that Wisconsin DNR map for jack pine, etc. Pros and cons of seed transfer guidelines. All right, we talked about how that can help us and also can hinder us because sometimes it's just viewed as a geographic viewed in geographic isolation. And then that risk, one zone, really not a problem, 200 miles, not a problem, but multiple, yeah, you start to infer some risk. Why do we fear climate change? Yeah, what are we actually thinking we're going to lose? That was that Davis figure, and how populations can get mismatched with the current climate. What species are coming, and thoughts and ideas regarding regeneration. And I believe that's it. So I am more than happy to handle questions. We're about 42 minutes in. If we're 45 minutes in,
Yeah,
worked out pretty well.
Yeah, we're great. And there are several questions here. I'll read them out. Folks can keep them coming either through the Q&A or the chat. Either way is just fine. Andy, first, what are the chances you'll get a good cross-section of genotypes in one nursery order of, say, 500 seedlings? What about 10,000 or 100,000 seedlings?
That all depends on where those seeds came from. So if you are, if they're collected from multiple trees in a seed zone and they're all bulked and they're run through and planted as a bulk selection in all the, and I'm strictly thinking of a larger operation here. And they're, you know, planted out in the seed beds or planted in styro blocks. I would say 500 is good, you know, because it's all going to be mixed and tumbled. I don't think they're keeping them separate by collectors, if you will. They're not keeping them separate by families. They're putting all of those together. I think 500 is probably pretty good. Yeah, and the other two, not a problem.
So early in the talk, you talked about 30 trees per species in order to get a range of genetic variation within that seed source. And yeah, so you're saying that if it's collected from 30 or more and so on, so those would be questions that hopefully you could ask that nursery and they could tell you a bit about the seed collection practices. Next question is, what about long distance east-west transfers? So you talked about this a little bit, maybe after this came in, but commercial, this person says commercial seedling vendors are offering yellow birch seedlings from seed collected in Nova Scotia. What should I expect if I plant those seedlings in terms of adaptation to Minnesota and to a changing climate?
I don't know what you should expect. That's never been tested, to my knowledge, in Minnesota. You know, they'll probably point to the fact that, oh, this is the plant hardiness zone is the same. USDA plant hardiness zone. It's the same in the portion of Nova Scotia as you want to plant in Minnesota. And my point is, there's a lot more to consider. I mean, you want to think about things like adaptation to photo period. You want to think about things like, you know, maybe soils, maybe climate, how, you know, that plant hardiness zone that USDA puts out is good in that it tells us what the minimum temperature is usually in an average year. It tells you nothing about length of growing season. It tells you nothing about how that population is adapted to a photo period, both at the beginning of the growing season and the end. As a forest geneticist, I would test that before I would buy and plant. Otherwise, you are testing it. And if you do that, let us know.
Oh, we got a couple of other questions, but I'll go to this one next because you're on the topic now. Is there a reference to a good recent journal article on the topic? And from the timing that came in, I think it might refer to the question about genetic variation within within seedling stock that you would get from a nursery. I noticed that the Eastern Seed Zone forum has a link to the Journal of Forestry article. Is that a good source? Are there others?
It kind of depends on what you're looking for. That JOF article for the Eastern Seed Zone group is more along the lines of, this is how it was set up, this is why we're doing it, this is what we think our seed transfer guidelines should be. If you're interested in more of an article that explains how, 30 individuals is a good 30 unrelated individuals is a good representation of the genetic variation in a population, then you've got to go back, you've got to go older, you've got to go like 1987, 1985, 1995 time periods in there. And a lot of that will be comparing native populations with native populations harvested, unharvested, and then looking at those seedlings coming out of an artificial regen program that's specific for that area. So there are ways to do that. And if you want to DM me, I can help you with that. But some of that is older material.
All right, thanks, Andy. I did just put in the chat a link again to that Eastern Seed Zones site, which has a link to the Journal of Forestry article. But as Andy said, you can reach out to him and we can help you connect with him too. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. Interesting response, Andy, to the question about Nova Scotia yellow birch. The person who asked the question, Matt Petz-Jaguar, says, arguably, because this is a Minnesota vendor, it is being tested, but we're just not studying it, or at least it's in the ground, but we're not looking at those results. Yeah, we're always looking, Lane said in the chat, for anyone who is doing that to share your results on the Great Lakes Silviculture Library. So
actually, that's a perfect venue for reporting that.
It really is. So let us know if you know anyone planting that Nova Scotia yellow birch. We'd love to know about it and see what's going on. Thanks for the questions. Again, keep them coming. This is good. So we've had a few questions, Andy, about nursery stock and genetic variation. Question came in early on. Do private nurseries take any care in seed source for their stock?
Some do, some don't. I think most private nurseries advertise the plant hardiness zone, or they'll tell you, and we've run into this, Eastern hemlock, sources collected from Pennsylvania. And that's great. You need to know that. You just then need to decide, is that information enough for me to make a decision? And quite frankly, if you're planting around your house, plant hardiness zone is probably adequate. If you're planting around, 350 acres scattered on 6 parcels that were recently harvested, that becomes a little more problematic. And maybe, you look at that and say, oh, all right, I'm gonna plant these, but I'm also gonna do natural regen. Then you're kind of bulking up your natural regen possibilities. But if you're planting a species that doesn't exist there now, where there cannot be any natural regen, you're kind of going out on a limb. If you can get plant hardiness zone and a location, that's great. And if you can then ask, how is this collected? Is it bulk seed from multiple individuals? Is it bulk seed from 2? Is it bulk seed from 50? And my guess is a private nursery doesn't have that kind of information, or the person you talk to on the phone doesn't have that kind of information. And Some nurseries have multiple collectors out selling them, collecting seed and selling it to them that they then go ahead and sell or grow up, I should say. Others will buy seedlings, small, and grow them to size. That becomes even more complicated because they may or may not have the same seed source every year. They may or may not be getting seedlings from the same place every year. And so tracking that is something that they don't typically do very well. Because that's not historically been their job. That's why the DNR system is really great, because that is something they have done for decades and they do it really well. And in fact, in many places, in many state nurseries, that's what they shoot for. They want that level of transparency.
At this point, we've only got one more question, so unless any others come in, we may be nearing the end. Andy, loggers have told this person that they feel bur oak and white oak have hybridized. Are they full of it?
That's possible. I mean, white oak subgroup can cross, red oak subgroup can cross. So, northern red oak and northern pin oak, northern red oak, pin oak, northern pin oak, all of those. They're kind of loose in their morals. We want to look at it that way. White oaks can do the same thing. All right. I think if you look at bur oak and where white oak is in the state, you'll find that white oak really is limited to the southern portion of the state, and particularly kind of like that southeast, south central portion. Bur oak is pretty much throughout the state. So that becomes, if you're in central Minnesota or you're up near, Grand Rapids and you're saying, well, white oak and bur oak are hybridizing. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of white oak up there to hybridize with. I think you're just looking at natural range of variability in bur oak. But yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. I was just saying we were done. And speaking of hybrids, what do you know about heart-leaved birch? Some have speculated it's a cross between paper birch and yellow birch, or is it something else?
I don't know anything about heart-leaved birch. I've never heard of it before. I don't think, I'd have to check this, but I don't think natural hybridization occurs between paper birch and yellow. But I'd have to check that to be absolutely certain. All right, folks, thank you for your attention. Thanks for coming today. Thanks for your questions. I enjoyed it. Lane?
Thanks, Andy. I'll just reiterate what I said in the chat. Our next webinar, typically we shoot for every second Tuesday. Our next one is actually on a Thursday. So that's March 16th, again at 9 a.m. And that'll be a forest health update from the Minnesota DNR, as we've done in previous years. I think with that, thank you all for coming and tuning in. Thanks for your patience as we had our first in-person webinar in a minute. And we'll see you all next month. Thank you.